prepare a 3D design for a process such as 3D printing. While 3D design does not always mean creating something for 3D printing, it is often one of the more popular choices to go ahead and use. We're going to take our wolf that we created in the previous section and we're going to export it to our desktop in order to go ahead and create it. When we are exporting, we want to make sure that we have everything in the design selected and we're exporting it as an STL. And I'm going to go ahead and have this STL on my desktop for easy access. Now, I am going to go ahead and download something that is called a slicer software in order to prep it for 3D printing. Because while we now have our 3D model, we need to go through the steps of anticipating all the needs of the printer, putting the settings in to create our STL into something that's referred to as a G-code. That finalizes the formatting created for an object in order to prepare it for printing. So for instance, that will allow us to, as the name suggests, slice every layer to anticipate things such as, does the density need to be stronger? Does this need additional supports in order to print? Because keep in mind, 3D printing means printing layer by layer up. The slicer software we're going to use is Prusa. Prusa is free to download through your own device, or you are welcome to use one of the laptops available in the makerspace. When you go to PrusaSlicer, you want to make sure that you're downloading the appropriate slicer for your device. So if you have a Windows, make sure you're downloading for a Windows. For a Mac, make sure you're downloading for a Mac, or anything else such as shown. If you just Google PrusaSlicer, that is the easy way to go ahead and find it, and it'll be available. Oftentimes it's the first result, but it's good to go ahead and know this. The reason why we're using PrusaSlicer is because the printers available in the makerspace are Prusa printers. Oftentimes you want to go ahead and make sure to match the PrusaSlicer, or the slicer software, with the printer itself. This helps to avoid any possible issues that could go from, say, using something such as Cura, which is made more for low spot printers, and causing any kind of issues when printing on a Prusa. Once you have your software selected, we're going to go ahead and go through the settings made. So you'll be opening up a device such as this, with the icon shown here. And oftentimes you'll be prompted to this page right here. If you don't see this page, don't panic. I will review how to go ahead and get to this page. We're going to go ahead and get our slicer software set up for the mini printers. However, there are other printers that are available. For instance, this is another common one seen in the makerspace. Both have a 0.4 nozzle, so you want to go ahead and make sure that one is selected. We're going to go ahead and hit next, 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 next. And now we're going to go ahead and select the printer we're going to be using. For us, it's a mini. So we want to go ahead and select that mini, as well as PLA. PLA is referring to the different type of filament that is available for a printer. PLA stands for polylactic acid. It is made from cornstarch and it is biodegradable. The reason why we are selecting the filament is that there are different types of temperatures that the printer knows setting-wise to heat filament in order to melt it to be used for 3D printing. There's lots of different types of filament. The one provided always in the makerspace is PLA, which is something to keep in mind when it comes to your projects. You want to make sure that generic is selected before hitting next. Next one more time. Next. And I always recommend with view mode to go ahead and have it as expert mode. It's going to show you all the different types of possibilities and settings available to you that sometimes aren't you're aware of when you are using something such as simple mode. This is an easy fix, however, if you do hit simple mode, you just go ahead and click expert mode, which I'll show you. And then I have everything switched to inches as well, because that is what I would like to go ahead and see when I'm using it. I'm going to go ahead and hit finish, and now we're all set to go. Now, remember what I said before, if you didn't see that screen, and perhaps maybe you were instead put to this screen with nothing selected over here. You will instead go ahead and hit add, right here, this little drop down next to the printer, add remove printers, remove presets, and you're right back to where that screen is. Don't worry about that too much. I'm going to go ahead and hit cancel, but that's your way to go ahead and go through that process. There's a lot of different things you'll notice here. However, it's going to be easier once we get an object on this work plane for us to take a look around. You can either file open the STL file you saved, or drag it directly onto the work plane, which is what I'm going to do. Now when I drag it around, it is going to be similar to what we used before, where I can spin around, take all different looks at it, see what's going on. And we see the name right over here. I can also add multiples of this. So let's say I want to add another object on here. I can continue to do so. The white line right here shows the restriction of the size of this printer when it comes to a Prusa Mini. So roughly for a Prusa Mini, it's between, I believe it's about 6 or 7 inches is the build plate that you can go ahead and use size-wise, which is something to keep in mind. And if it is not going to allow it, it'll go ahead and show us when we are prepping it to go into STL to a G code. We can see different options off to the left. We can see how we can move this object. So for instance, using this, and it's all color coded. So that way we can go ahead and have a good idea to see that this is our Z, this is our Y, and this is our X. Oftentimes Z is usually referring to height, which is a good way to go ahead and denote the difference. We can scale it, doing a different scale. We can rotate it. And these functions are also available over here where we can click inside the box. We can also place it on something that's called place face, which is this option right here. This is important to note because oftentimes when we bring in an object into the work plane, we want to place it on the face that's going to have the best results when printing. So for instance, if I place it here, that might not be as successful of a print. 3D printers often print layer by layer, and so going up, there isn't a lot of room or touch points that are going with this printer. So printing in this direction might actually fail. We want to give the printer the best chance for success, so we want to go ahead and put it on the best face. In this case, that would be this one right here. It's a flat surface. It's allowing a lot of flexibility when it comes to providing the support and stability we need for a 3D printer. I can also do other things such as cut, paint on supports, as well as seam painting. I can also copy what I'm doing either through shorthands, clicks on depending on your device, or copying and pasting here. And notice how it creates another object. I can also go ahead and get rid of that as well, if I so choose. Either there, or I can always just use my friendly undo button, which is a great button to have if you ever need it. I can also arrange, I can add, and I can also subtract here. Now, there are other options available as well. I have quality listed over here, the filament like I mentioned, and then we can also do something that's called supports. Support structures provide support when a print is printing layer by layer up. For instance, because it's going layer by layer, we can look at our wolf's tail. When it gets to this level, there might not be anything to support it, which means that our tail would fail by the time the printer got to this layer. So we want to go ahead and make sure we have supports clicked. Do all 3D prints need support? Not necessarily. It really does depend on angles, particularly the design of the print. Sometimes prints don't need any support at all. But we're going to go ahead and put support everywhere. Now there's support on build plate only, which means that's only going between an object and the build plate itself. And sometimes that's all you need. So for instance, if we didn't have the stand, we would just have the build plate only. Now, there are other options as well. There's support enforcers. That's that button that I mentioned over here. I can paint on supports and click paint and support enforcers. And that's only going to put supports in the areas that I painted on that object. And I can decide on that using this function right over here. However, that's not something that we necessarily need for this type of print. I'm going to go ahead and put everywhere, because that's going to put it everywhere. I'm going to hit yes. We'll take a look at this in just a moment to see what it did. I'm also going to decide on my infill. Now, infill is referring to the density of a print. Oftentimes for a decorative object, less than 20% is usually pretty good to use. So for instance, I can use 20% and this would be fine, or I could use 10 or 15 and this object would more than likely be all right. Now let's say that I was creating something such as a hook. Now if I was creating a 3D printing a hook, I might need a higher density. A high density would be anywhere from 50% to 100%. However, check with a Makerspace staff member to go ahead and review infills if you are concerned about what kind of percentage you should use. Oftentimes, a print doesn't need 100% unless you have a very specific reason to be using it. So, anytime you think that you may need to go 50% or above, go ahead and talk to a staff member. Now, brim is referring to additional support that I could put on my build plate. So let's say that, for instance, I was really worried about the way that this was going to print. Perhaps I was going to print it very small. and I wanted to make sure it adhered to the build plate for the best possible stability when printing. I can click the Brim button, and Brim puts an additional layer of material when printing to provide more support to this object. It shouldn't be necessary for this object, but it is just a click button right over here. Now there are additional functions right here, such as print settings, which I can take a look at, that allow me to make additional choices for this. For instance, I can look at my infill. I can look at my infill pattern. There's an example of the different types of infill patterns in the makerspace for you to take a look at. Oftentimes, this is the default. I can take a look at my skirt and my brim. I can take a look at my support material. I can look at the overhang threshold. I can continue to make all these changes. Now, the more comfortable you get with 3D printing, the more you can go ahead and delve into these options. Oftentimes, it's not necessary to look at these unless you are looking for something very specific or trying to have a very specific function. But it is something to consider, particularly if you're looking for something such as customizing a G-code or looking at the printer settings itself. So for instance, let's say that you are really curious about the Z offset and you needed to go ahead and alter it for your print, you would go ahead and come over here. And this is why I always recommend having it in expert mode, because like I mentioned before, if I go to simple, it gets rid of some of these options for you to see. So having it in expert shows you everything. Now scrolling down over here, I can see different options here. This is telling me the position of my print, the rotation, the scale factor. So right now, this is about 3 inches, but a little under 2 inches high. Now if I were to change any of these, let's say I want it to be 5 inches, it will go ahead and alter this. Now it's shifting everything because this lock function's on. If I unclick it, I can alter this, and it would only change the parameter that I am changing. So for in this case, it's going to be X. I don't want that though, so I'm going to hit my undo button. Then I'm going to go ahead and lock this one more time. But that's something you can go ahead and look at. I also see my inches here, so let's say I'm curious what it looks like in millimeters. I can go ahead and take that look right there. So there is some flexibility in being able to change an object once you get into the slicer software. Now that I have done all the changes that I feel like I need to make, I'm going to go ahead and slice this object. Hitting slice now, and sometimes this process can take a moment to go ahead and take a look at what I'm making. Ooh. As we can see, this is already looking quite different. We are now in this section versus this section. If I go into the 3D editor, which is right here, I'm back to this object. But I can come back over here and look at our perimeter. Here's a breakdown of the time, as well as the percentage of exactly how much time is being spent on each section. This is our support material. That's what I mentioned before when I said everywhere. Now, if we take this off with tools in the makerspace, it sometimes can take a lot of time or sometimes no time at all. Now, when I scroll on down, I can see different things. I can see the amount of filament that's being used, and this is going to be broken down into grams. And this is good to know because you never want to choose a filament that is running out when it comes to your grams. I can also see the time it would take, which is also important to know. So say I look at this and I go, you know what? I actually was hoping for this to be done in the same day, and I was hoping to be able to pick it up. Maybe I need to make this print smaller. I can go back over here and decide, you know what? I want to make this print a lot smaller. So I can alter the size here, but maybe instead I want to do it through percentage. Maybe I want to have that size. Oh, that's not great. Maybe I want it 75% of the original file. And maybe I want to slice this now. Does that change my time? It does. It actually drops it down to 2 hours, or a little less than 2 hours. So I think that this is going to be a fine print. Now, what does it look like if there's going to be an issue? So for instance, let's say this object, for some reason, is all the way over here. Already it's telling me that I have an error, and this isn't going to work. But let's say it was very, very slight. And let me say that I'm going to slice this. Oh no, I have an error. So that's how you know that if the printer is going to have an issue or not. If this does end up happening to you, and you're not really sure why you're getting an error, go ahead and check in with a Makerspace staff member. However, I'm just going to go ahead and undo this and get it back to where it was. And now I have this slice now. We are now in a G-code. So I can go ahead and export this G-code to a USB for one of the Prusa printers and go ahead and put it in and get my print started while also leaving a paper with all this information filled out. So other things to go ahead as well and keep in mind is that if you do have a G-code, keep in mind you can't modify a G-code. so you do want to have it saved. You can only modify an STL. The G code itself is unfortunately something that you can't modify, but you do want to make sure you have a copy with it in case you do need to do duplications, things of that nature. As I said, however, if you do have any additional questions or concerns, make sure to chat with a Makerspace staff member or submit a tech consultation for a library staff member to go ahead and assist you with all your 3D printing or 3D design needs.